Greetings, students. Today we are going to go through some problems and figure out how to solve some common cladograms. So this is what a typical problem might look like. This is an example with candy bars, so you probably won't see a candy bar example in the AP test, but still sort of an authentic example. So usually you'll be given some sort of like data table here, and then you'll have to use that data table to fill in information in a pre-drawn cladogram where there will be blanks. I can't think of any examples where they make you completely draw the cladogram yourself. Usually they'll give you a template, or it might be like which of these options is the best representation of this data. And that's just because there's oftentimes a lot of ways you could draw the cladogram, and at least from what I've seen, that seems to be beyond the scope of AP Bio. Okay, so what would these types of questions look like? Like I said, they'll make you complete a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree given a table of information. That information might be something like traits. So that's what this example here is showing us. There are different characteristics of the species of candy. And in this case, if they give you traits, you'll also need to add those traits to the cladogram, and I will show you how to do that in just a second. Or they might give you some sort of molecular data. So molecular data could be sequences, so actual DNA nucleotide sequences or amino acid sequences, and then you'd have to compare the sequence of like species A versus species B. Or they might give you sequence similarities or differences as a percent. So that's just saying, you know, species A compared to species B, they are 10% different, or something like that, and then you'd have to use that data. So we're going to do some examples using all of these different types of data so you can see how we construct these cladograms. Okay, so to start, let's go ahead and look at this candy cladogram example. So this is sort of an example of the type of data table you might see if it's showing you traits. So in this case, anytime you see an X, it means that the species has that trait. So if we look at this table, we can see that all of the species are candy. And for example, like Snickers is also has peanuts as one of its traits. That's what the X means. Okay, so on that same vein, what are the traits that Snickers have? So to answer that, we would just look in the Snickers column and see anywhere they have an X. So they would be candy, peanuts, milk chocolate, and caramel, but they don't have dark chocolate because there's no X there. So that's just understanding how we read this chart. Okay, another one. Which species have the caramel trait? So for this, we have to look just in this caramel row, and we see that Milky Way Dark, and Snickers are the only species that have that trait, whereas Skittles and Three Musketeers do not. Okay, another one. What trait is shared by most or all of the species? This is an important first step for any of these types of problems you have to deal with traits. So this is always what you're going to want to start with doing, is ask which trait seems to be the most common. In that case, or in this case, if we look, it's going to be candy. All of the species in this example all have the candy trait. So that is sort of the one unifying trait. And then finally, the next question we'll want to ask is, what is the outgroup? So remember from the reading and from the first video you watched, the outgroup is sort of the most ancestral species, or the species that's most dissimilar from all of the other ones. So looking at this, which one is the most dissimilar? Well, Skittles doesn't have any other traits in this table. It only has candy. So in this case, Skittles is going to be the outgroup. And the reason we're using candy as an example is just being familiar with these candies, that's really obvious, right? Like Milky Way Dark, Snickers, Three Musketeers, those are all chocolatey candies, and Skittles is the only one that isn't. So it's very clear here what the outgroup is, and that's just to help you guys see, oh, it's the outgroup, it only has one single trait in common. Okay, so now we can go ahead and start to construct this cladogram. So this is the cladogram template that we are given. So let me walk through what some of this stuff means here. So these little red dashes, we're going to want to put traits here. So here we're going to write things like candy, peanuts, dark chocolate, etc. We're going to write one of those at each of those dashes. On the other hand, in these boxes, we're going to write things like traits, peanuts, milk chocolate, etc. We're going to write one of those at each of those dashes. So here we're going to write things like candy, peanuts, dark chocolate, etc. We're going to write one of those at each of those dashes. On the other hand, in these boxes, we're going to write things like traits, peanuts, milk chocolate, etc. We're going to write one of those at each of those dashes. And these boxes, that's where we're gonna put the species. So Three Musketeers, etc., all that stuff is gonna go in those boxes. And then the way we'll read it would be, for example, like this trait, let me do it in a different color. This trait would be a trait that is shared by all of the species going up. So it would be every species except for that first one. And that should feel familiar after doing the first review video. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started on this problem. So the first thing we're going to want to do, which we've already done, is figure out which trait is the most common, which trait is shared by all of them. And that's going to be the trait that goes in that very first dash. And so we already know that's going to be candy. So I'm going to go ahead and just write candy here. And then to keep myself organized, I'm going to go ahead and just cross candy off this list so I don't have to worry about it anymore. Okay, and then next, if we go up the cladogram, we can see the next thing we come to is this species up here. This, once again, is the most dissimilar species, the most ancestral or the oldest species. This is the outgroup. And we already figured out that in this case, the outgroup is Skittles because it's the most dissimilar from the other ones. So we're going to go ahead and write Skittles right here. And then to keep us organized, I like to just go ahead and just cross out that whole column so I know that I can ignore it for the next steps. Okay, so candy, got that. Skittles, got that. Okay, how do we figure out the next one? Okay, so to figure out what comes next, I actually like to work by trying to figure out this next species. And the reason for that is we can see that this species only has two traits. It's going to have candy and whatever another trait is. So if we look in our table, we're going to look for a species that only has two traits. And if we look in the table, we can see that that's going to be Three Musketeers. They just have candy and milk chocolate. So that means the species is going to be Three Musketeers. I'm going to write Three Musk. We'll cross that off so we don't get confused. And then if this is Three Musketeers, that means this trait down here must be the other trait that Three Musketeers has. So that's going to be milk chocolate. And I'm going to cross the milk chocolate off so I don't get confused. Okay, next. So now we'll do the same thing. We're just going to go up the cladogram, and we can see in the next space in the cladogram we have a branch point. So we have two different species here that are going to be really similar, except one of them has a different trait than the other. So for this one, same thing. I'm going to look this one here, which we'll do a little star here. This one's only going to have 1, 2, 3 traits. We know one's going to be candy, one's going to be milk chocolate, and then one's going to be something different. So I'm going to go ahead and just look and see in my table which ones have that. So the only options with 3 traits are Milky Way or Milky Way Dark. And we can see that Milky Way has candy, milk chocolate, and caramel, whereas Milky Way Dark has candy, dark chocolate, and caramel. So looking at that, both of them have caramel in common, so that means that this next trait must be caramel. And then those are the 3 traits that Milky Way has, so that means we know that this one must be Milky Way. And then down here, this is going to be Milky Way Dark. And this trait I circled there is going to be dark chocolate. And then same thing, we'll just go through and cross off the ones that we've done so that we don't get ourselves confused. So we did dark chocolate, and we did caramel, and just cross this off. Nope, nope. Okay, and then finally we only have 1 species left, so this is going to be really easy. The only species we have left is Snickers. And we only have 1 trait left. Sorry, I accidentally included peanuts on here twice, but it's the same data, just I accidentally included an extra row. So peanuts is going to be the last trait here. Okay, and there we go. So let's go ahead and do another one. Okay, so this is an example that's a little more authentic than candy, but same idea. So this is an example where we are given a data table of traits, and we need to use that to fill in the cladogram. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to want to look at our table and find out what is the trait that is shared or is the most common trait. So if we look here, that's going to be this one, heterotroph. So we know that heterotroph must be the very first trait in the cladogram. So it's going to be this one down here at the bottom. Okay, there we go. So I'm just going to cross off that trait to keep myself organized. Okay, so now working up, going up in the cladogram, the next spot we have is right up here. So we're going to have these two branches. These are going to be two species. There's no boxes on this cladogram, but we're going to write one species here and one species here. So I hope what you can see is that these species are both going to have the heterotroph trait as well as one other trait. So they are each going to have two traits. As we go further up the cladogram, all these other species are going to have more than two. So the way we can figure out which species these are is we'll just look for the ones that have two traits. So let's go ahead and look in the table, and we can see those species are going to be species A and species C. So I'm going to go ahead and place those, A and C. Now you might be wondering, how did I know to place A to the left and C to the right? The answer is, it doesn't matter. All that matters is I need to make sure that this trait that I'm putting here with A is the trait that A has. So it's going to need to be two part limbs. So I'm just going to write two limbs. And then same thing for C. I'm going to make sure I want to write the trait that C has. So it's going to be exposed mouth parts. I'm just going to write mouth parts. And it would have been just as valid for me to flip that and have C be on the left and write mouth parts here. Doesn't matter. All that matters is that these match up. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to cross off A and C from my list there. And now we'll just move up. So now moving up, we have this other trait. And we can see that this trait is going to be shared by all the remaining species except for A and C. So looking in the table, can you see which trait that is going to be that's shared by all the remaining species? Yeah, so it's going to be this one up here. It's going to be vertebrae. So you can see vertebrae is the only thing that's in everything else. So that's what this trait's going to be. And then same thing, I'm just going to cross it off the table so I can stay organized. Okay, and now we have these next two traits. They're going to be species that have heterotroph and vertebrae as traits, as well as one other one. So I'm looking for species with three traits. So let's look in our table. We have species E and F. They both have three traits, so I'll put those on there. Once again, doesn't matter the order, I just need to be consistent. And then I'll look, so species E has vertebra, that's already on there. Heterotroph, that's already on there, and then it has palatal valve. So that's going to be the trait I'm going to write here next to it. I'll cross that off. And then F, on the other hand, here has vertebra and feathers. That's going to be the new trait, so feathers. I'll cross that off, and then I'll just go ahead and cross both of these off the table to keep myself organized. Okay, and now as we go up, there's going to be one more trait here that'll be shared among the last two species. So I'm going to look, the only species we have left are B and D. This is why it's nice to cross off as you go, because it's going to make it easier. We can see the only trait that hasn't been placed yet is fur. So fur is going to be what's going to go on this next part here. This is going to be fur. Cross that off. And then we'll just place B and D. And then same thing, we'll be consistent about the traits that go with each one. So the trait that B has that's sort of unique to B is opposable thumbs. So I'll put this here. I'm just gonna write thumbs. That kind of says thumbs. And then the trait that D has that no other species has is incisors. Okay, and there we go. As we can go through, we can make sure that we've gotten all of our species and all of our traits crossed off and everything looks good. Like I said, you could always check your work by picking a species and then just making sure the traits on the cladogram match up with the traits in the table. And there we go. That's how you do a cladogram using traits. Okay, let's move on to another one. Okay, so now in this example, instead of using traits to make our cladogram, we're using molecular data. So it's really important in these examples that you read the table, because sometimes the tables will give you differences, but sometimes they'll give you similarities, and it's confusing. So in this case, it's giving us differences. So the higher the number, the more different the two species, which if we look at these animals makes sense. In this case, these are animals we are familiar with. So like a horse and a snake seem very dissimilar as opposed to a horse and a donkey. So big numbers mean less similar, more dissimilar. Okay, so when we read this table, you might notice that on the diagonal here, there's a bunch of zeros. What's up with that? Well, if we look, this is horse versus horse. So what are the differences, horse versus horse? Well, they're the same thing. So that's why it says 0. You might also be wondering, why is the second half of this table blank? And that's just because the data in this bottom half of the table is already in another place in the table. So it's trying to just save space, kind of. So we can see this blank here is donkey and horse. Well, that's already shown over here. So I actually like having all the numbers filled in the table. It helps me see the patterns better. So I like to go in and just copy the numbers down so my data doesn't have any blanks in it. So to do that, like donkey versus horse, that's just what is written right here. So I'll just write 1, and then horse and chicken, that's what's right here. So 11, 13, 21, and I'll just go through and fill all of those in for all of the species. Okay, there we go. Like I said, I find it easier when all the numbers are filled in. If you don't have to do that step. Okay, so now what we are going to want to do, in this cladogram there's no traits to place. We don't need to worry about traits. We only need to think about how similar are all these different animals to each other. So the first thing we need to do is find the outgroup. Remember, the outgroup is the one that's the most different from all the others. And here, differences are bigger numbers. So in other words, we want to find which species has, on average, the greatest number in this column. So you could literally like type these into your calculator and find the average. For me, at least, I can tell just by looking at the table that snake is going to be, when we add all those up, the biggest difference. We can see all of the numbers for snake are greater than 15, and it's the only species that has differences that are that big across the board. So we know that snake is going to be the outgroup. Oh, sorry about that. So since snake is the outgroup, snake is the one that we are going to place first. So we are going to put snake right here. And then the way that we do this next is, if we look, this one that's going to go here, it's going to be one of the species that's most similar to the snake compared to the other 3 options. So it's really easy now. We just ask which species is most similar to the snake, or in other words, has the least differences. So looking just in the snake column, the lowest number is going to be penguin. So penguin is going to go here. And then next will be chicken. I should mention that we could have also flipped chicken and penguin there, and it would have been equally as correct because they're coming off the same branch point, so it doesn't really matter which way we put them, and since there's no traits here, both are correct. And then same thing for the next one. It's going to be donkey, and then finally horse. And that's it. That's pretty easy, right? Okay, let's do another one. Okay, same thing. This is going to be another problem where we have amino acid differences. So once again, big numbers mean more different. And this time we're not using animals that we've heard of before, so we can't like check our understanding like in the previous one. It makes sense that penguin and chicken are like off the same branch point because we know what a penguin and a chicken is. We don't have the advantage of that here because these are all scientific names, and unless you are an incredibly smart person who has memorized the scientific names of a bunch of different animals, you probably don't know what these are. Okay, so I'm going to start just by copying the data into the bottom half of the table here because I like to do that. There we go. Okay, now same thing, we'll look at which species has the most differences. So in other words, in this case, it's going to be the highest average distance. Once again, you could calculate this and put it into your calculator and see which one. Just looking at it, I can tell it's going to be this one. Because once again, all of the values are like greater than 15, and it's the only one that has that many differences. So this guy is going to be the outgroup. So we're going to put that one first. And then we'll do the same thing. The next species on the cladogram, the one that's going to go here, is going to be the one that's most similar or least different to polylepsis. So looking just in the polylepsis column, the lowest number is for steri, so that's what's going to go here. And then what's going to go next? Well, it's going to be the next lowest number, which is Gallus. And once again, those could have been flipped, that's okay. And then what comes next? Well, next lowest is Africanus. And then finally, the last one is Ferris. And there we go. And that's pretty much all of the type of cladogram problems you are likely to see. Like I said, sometimes instead of giving you a table of differences, they might just give you amino acid sequences themselves, and you'll have to sort of calculate the differences yourself. I think there's one example in the practice problems that does that, and usually those are very similar to these. You'll kind of do the same thing where you'll just count up the number of differences. All right, that's it. So go ahead and now try on your own to work through those practice problems, and then you can check yourself against the key. Good luck.